When I finally decided to speak up, it wasn't to defend myself. It was because I already knew exactly who deserved my respect and who never did. My name is Christina. I am 49 years old, and for months I heard the same thing at work, said with pity or mockery, depending on who was speaking, that I was weak, submissive, complacent, the employee who swallows everything and still apologizes. I left. I left because no one there understood that my silence wasn't fear. It was a choice. And choice has a price, but it also has a purpose. When he started, my superior, the untouchable one in the department, it wasn't with shouting. It was with those little comments which seem like jokes, but get under your skin. Irony in front of others. A compliment that came with venom. You're good. You just need to learn not to be so sensitive, as if respect were a favor and dignity were an exaggeration. I saw colleagues asserting themselves and at the end of the day, being called problematic. I saw people crying in the bathroom and coming back with their faces washed, pretending it was an allergy. I saw it all, and even so, I didn't retaliate, because reacting too quickly only protects those who don't deserve it. So I did what nobody noticed. I observed. I observed how he treated those who needed that job, how he spoke to older people, how he smiled at those in positions of power, and belittled those in need. I observed who laughed along, who pretended not to hear, who lowered their heads to avoid becoming a target. And while everyone thought I was just holding on, I was collecting certainty. There was a day when he tried to corner me in a meeting, with an unfair demand and a comment designed to break me inside. I felt my blood boil, my throat tighten, and I felt the urge to respond in kind. But I breathed. And I stayed quiet. The silence in the room became heavy, not because I was weak, but because, at that moment, I understood that I wasn't alone. I was just being watched too. And it was there that I decided I would only speak when I was sure. Because some answers aren't for those who hurt you. These are for those who are watching and learning who deserves respect. I didn't arrive at that silence by chance. It was built over time, with stumbles, losses, and lessons that were too costly to be forgotten. I started working very early. Coming from a humble family, I quickly learned that hard work wasn't an option, it was survival. While other people talked about vocation, I talked about responsibility. I needed to help at home, pay bills, prove every day that I deserved to be where I was. And I did it the way I knew how. Working more, talking less. Over the years, I've worked for different companies, in different roles, always maintaining the same attitude, commitment, respect, and dedication. I was never the brightest person in the room, but I was always the most consistent, the one they could trust when something really needed to be done without the spotlight. But that attitude cost me scars. There was a time years before that job when I believed that reacting was a sign of strength. I clearly remember an old situation, a boss who overstepped his bounds, an unfair demand, a public humiliation. That day, I responded. I spoke firmly. I defended myself. I thought I was doing the right thing. Days later, I was called in for a conversation. The speech was nice. Organizational climate. Difficult profile. Lack of flexibility. The result was simple and cruel. I left. Not officially because of that, of course. There's always a technical justification. But I knew, and so did they. I learned a lesson there that no one teaches in courses. Not all truth is welcome when it threatens the comfort of those in power. After that, other situations arose. In some, I remained silent out of fear. In others, out of exhaustion. Until, with time, silence ceased to be an escape and became a method. I began to notice patterns. To understand that abusive people rarely make mistakes only once. They repeat. They test. They advance when they encounter no resistance or when they perceive vulnerability. And I promised myself that I would never react impulsively again. I would never again give my voice away before understanding the whole situation. When I arrived at that company, I arrived with that promise intact. It was a competitive environment, full of subtle games, rigid hierarchies, and inflated egos. I entered discreetly, as always, working, observing, learning the invisible paths. At first, he seemed merely demanding, tough, but efficient. Many said, that's just how he is. And I'd heard that phrase before. I knew exactly what it usually concealed. The first comments came subtly, almost imperceptibly. A curt correction, a disdainful look when I asked a question, a compliment accompanied by a comparison. You did pretty well, for someone of your profile. That bothered me, yes, but I didn't react. Because I needed to understand if it was an isolated slip-up or something bigger. And most importantly, I needed to know if it was just happening to me. That's when I started observing more than just my own workplace. I began to notice how he spoke to the interns, to the older women, to those who didn't have a patron within the company. I started noticing who he interrupted, who he ignored, who he treated as invisible. And each little scene confirmed something I already knew inside. That wasn't personality. It was a pattern. Even so, I remained silent, not out of submission, but because I knew that if I opened my mouth too soon, everything could be reduced to a misunderstanding, an exaggerated sensitivity, a personal interpretation. I needed something more solid than my pain. Meanwhile, colleagues came to talk to me, some carefully, others impatiently. You need to stand up for yourself. He's crossing the line with you. If it were me, I wouldn't let it happen. I listened, I thanked them, and I remained quiet, because no one there was facing the consequences that I would face. At night, at home, I thought a lot. It wasn't easy. The silence also hurts. It keeps echoing inside, making you wonder if you're being unfair to yourself, if you're allowing too much, if you're normalizing what should never be normal. But there was something different this time. I didn't feel small. I felt attentive. I knew that silence was costing me discomfort now, but it could save me from something much bigger later. I was putting the pieces together, building clarity, protecting not only myself, but the truth. And that's how I definitively understood that not all injustice requires an immediate response. Some require maturity, others strategy, and some require enough patience to let the other person's character reveal itself. Because when that happens, no amount of shouting is necessary. The work environment seemed normal to an outsider. Computers were on. People were walking around with coffee in hand. Meetings were scheduled. Deadlines were tight. Nothing there screamed problem. But I learned early on that the biggest abuses almost never make a sound. They hide in the details. My day started early. I arrived before the scheduled time, organized my tasks, answered emails, reviewed reports. I did everything carefully because I always believed that excellence is a form of protection. The fewer mistakes I made, the fewer openings they would give me to attack. At least, that's what I thought. He, my direct superior, would arrive later. He'd walk through the room, glancing quickly, as if assessing who deserved a greeting or not. Sometimes he'd say good morning, other times, he'd just walk past. With me, he almost always walked past. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. You learn to doubt your own perception when you don't want to cause trouble. But the episodes started to repeat themselves. In meetings, he would correct my work harshly, even when the numbers were correct. He used a different tone, harder, drier. He never raised his voice, and that made everything harder to prove. This is confusing, he said, throwing the report on the table. You can redo it. Without explaining what was wrong, without allowing for questions. When someone from another department made a similar mistake, he would laugh, crack a joke, and fix it right away. I saw it, and I mentally noted it down. The comments were always disguised as jokes. You're very sensitive. You need to handle more pressure. At this rate, it's going to be difficult to grow here. Nothing explicit enough to generate collective outrage, but everything sharp enough to hurt. Some colleagues noticed, others pretended not to see. There were also those who preferred to side with him because they knew it would bring advantages. The atmosphere began to feel heavy, not because of the excessive workload, but because of the constant tension of not knowing when the next jab would come. Often, someone would approach me in the cafe or in the hallway. I saw what he did today. You need to take a stand. If you let him, he'll ride on top of you. I listened attentively to everything. I appreciated the concern. But inside, I was still watching, because it wasn't just me. I started noticing how he treated the interns. The most insecure ones were always the ones who faced the most pressure. Those who came from humble backgrounds, those without prestigious surnames, those who needed that job more than anything else. He spoke louder to them. He interrupted. He was sarcastic. With the directors, he was a different man. Polite, attentive, full of ideas, always available. That started to form a very clear pattern in my head. I wondered, does he realize what he's doing? Or does he do it precisely because he realizes it? Meanwhile, I remained silent, performing my duties, delivering results, and with each passing day, the contrast became more evident. The better I did my job, the colder he seemed towards me. There was no recognition, only demands. There was one specific episode that marked this phase. We were in a meeting with several departments. I presented a project that had been a lot of work. Overtime, weekends, meticulous review. When I finished, the director praised it. Excellent analysis. Before I could answer, he joined the conversation. Well, it turned out acceptable, but there's still a lot of room for improvement. Acceptable. The word kept echoing inside me. I looked around. Some people looked away. Others pretended to write something down. Nobody said anything. There, I felt a sharp pang. Not just of pain, but of clarity. That wasn't technical criticism. It was calculated evaluation. Even so, I remained quiet. That day, I came home exhausted, not physically, emotionally. I sat on the sofa in silence, going over everything. I knew that any reaction at that moment could be used against me. You don't know how to take feedback, they would say. You take everything personally. So I decided to delve deeper into my invisible test. I started observing even more. I mentally noted dates, situations, phrases. I noticed who was interrupted and who never was, who received patience and who received contempt, who could make mistakes and who didn't have that right. And the more I observed, the more the truth became clear. It wasn't a problem between him and me. It was a problem he had with anyone who didn't have the power to react. This changed something inside me. The pain continued, of course. Every hurtful comment still wounded me. Every complicit silence still weighed heavily. But now, the pain came with understanding. I wasn't being targeted because I was weak. I was being tested by someone who fed off hierarchy. And I needed to know how far this would go. There were days when I almost spoke. The urge rose in my throat, especially when he exaggerated. But I took a deep breath and remembered the past. I remembered the price I had already paid for reacting too quickly. I remembered that this time, I wanted more than just a venting session. I wanted justice, or at the very least, consistency. People started to find my behavior strange. Aren't you going to say anything? I wouldn't be that calm. I didn't respond, because I wasn't calm. I was focused. I was gathering evidence, not to attack, but so I wouldn't be discredited when the time came. And that moment began to approach when I realized something that changed everything. Nobody was safe there. Not even those who thought they were. I've seen colleagues who were once favored begin to be treated with impatience when they ceased to be useful. I've seen praise turn into demands. I've seen smiles turn into curt orders. There, I understood that it wasn't personal, but I also understood that I couldn't pretend to be small anymore. At that moment, a phrase formed clearly within me. I couldn't take it anymore. I understood, and understanding sometimes hurts more than reacting. The day of the public confrontation came without warning. There was no tension in the air, no sign that anything different was about to happen. That's precisely what made it all the harder. Injustice, when disguised as routine, tends to hurt more. It was a general meeting. The room was full. People sat side by side. Some stood leaning against the wall, projector on, coffee cooling in paper cups, cell phones on silent. I was there with my organized reports, knowing exactly what I had done, what I had delivered, and what I could support. He started the meeting as usual, speaking loudly, confidently, using fancy words to impress those above him. I listened, took notes, and took deep breaths, until it was my turn to present. I got up, plugged in my laptop, and started explaining the project's progress. I was clear and objective. I showed him numbers, deadlines, results. Everything was on schedule. As I spoke, I noticed he was watching me with that look I knew so well. It wasn't attention. It was a search for flaws. When I finished, there was a brief silence. A director made a positive comment, similar to those he had made on other occasions. I felt a short, almost imperceptible relief, but it didn't last long. He cleared his throat, leaned forward, and spoke in a tone loud enough for everyone to hear. The truth is, this result only happened because I was closely monitoring it. If it had depended solely on her, it would have been delayed. The sentence landed like a weight in the center of the room. For a second, no one reacted. I felt my face heat up, my stomach clench. That wasn't just criticism. It was a clear attempt to erase my work and to put me in a position of inadequacy in the eyes of everyone. I took a deep breath. I waited. Maybe someone would say something. Maybe someone would remember the meetings, the emails, the nights I stayed up late after he'd already left. But nobody said anything. He continued. Actually, I think there's a lack of commitment. Sometimes I feel like you don't get involved enough. Commitment. The word echoed within me like a cruel irony. I thought of all the times I arrived early, left late, skipped lunches, swallowed comments, remained professional while being belittled. It all flashed through my mind like a silent film. All eyes were on me now. Some curious, others uncomfortable, others indifferent. The expectation was clear. I should respond, defend myself, fight back, show that it was unfair. And I didn't say anything. It wasn't easy. My whole body reacted to the urge to speak. My throat tightened. My hands sweated. My heart was beating too fast for such a silent room. But I remained silent. I looked at him for a few seconds. Not angrily, attentively. It was the look of someone confirming something that had been brewing for a long time. He noticed my silence. He made an impatient gesture. Anything to say? I could have said many things. I could have recalled facts, dates, numbers. I could have exposed contradictions. I could have laid out the technical truth there before everyone. But this was no longer about technique. It was about character. So I simply replied, no one single word. The room grew even quieter. He seemed irritated, perhaps expecting a confrontation, but there wasn't one. He cleared his throat again, changed the subject, and continued the meeting. Inside, I was falling apart. I sat down slowly, feeling the weight of that exposure. It wasn't just what he had said. It was what no one had done. No interruptions, no comments, no attempt at balance. There, I understood something that changed everything. It wasn't just me. That collective silence was proof that many had seen similar things before and chosen to remain silent. Out of fear, out of convenience, out of exhaustion. As the meeting continued, I could barely hear anything else. My mind was elsewhere, organizing sensations, fitting the pieces together. Every previous episode now made sense. Every off-key comment, every unnecessary correction, every subtle exclusion. When the meeting ended, people left in small groups. Some passed by me and smiled awkwardly. Others pretended not to see me. No one commented on what had happened. I calmly gathered my things. I walked to my desk, sat down, and took a deep breath. It was then that the pain truly hit me. It wasn't an isolated humiliation. It was a realization. I had enough proof. Not on paper yet, but within myself. The pattern was complete. The behavior was repeated. The silence was complicit. And the injustice wasn't an accident, it was a method. Throughout the day, he passed by my desk twice more. The first time, he made a curt comment. We'll talk about that later. On Monday, he didn't say anything. He just gave a quick glance, as if assessing whether the other person had broken down. I continued working, not out of submission, but because I had already passed the point of impulsive reaction. Now, I was at another stage. The pain of that day was different. It wasn't explosive. It was deep. A pain that doesn't scream, but settles in. A pain that matures. When I got home, I dropped my bag, took off my shoes, and sat on the sofa without turning on the light. I stayed there in the dark for a few minutes, feeling everything I had held back all day finally come to the surface. I cried, not out of despair, out of clarity. I cried because I clearly saw that structure allowed it. That man only acted that way because he could. Because he knew that hardly anyone would confront him with solid grounds. Because silence was more comfortable for everyone except for the one who was being hurt. And in that weeping, a silent decision began to form. I would no longer wonder if it was personal. I would no longer doubt my perception. I would no longer react to prove my strength. I would act when I was sure. That day, the first climax wasn't a shout, nor an argument, nor a scandal. It was a heavy silence, laden with meaning, a silence that hurt more than any direct offense. Because there, in front of everyone, I understood clearly that wasn't an isolated problem. It wasn't a bad day. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. And patterns aren't confronted with impulse. They're confronted with awareness. And it was at that moment that I knew I was no longer just enduring it. I was ready to decide what to do with everything I had seen. I went home that day feeling like I was carrying an invisible weight on my shoulders. There were no marks on my body. No one had yelled at me. No one had raised their voice. Yet, I felt exhausted in a way that didn't come from work, it came from within. The drive home was automatic. I don't remember the light turning green, the sound of traffic, or the people around me. My head silently replayed the scene from the meeting, as if trying to understand something that, deep down, I already understood. When I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it for a few seconds. I stood there, feeling my breathing heavy, my thoughts racing, my body finally allowing the pain to manifest. It wasn't an immediate cry. It was a feeling of emptiness mixed with exhaustion. I slowly took off my shoes, dropped my bag anywhere, and went to the kitchen. I filled a glass with water, but I couldn't drink it. My hands were trembling slightly. That bothered me more than any word spoken in the meeting. I wasn't used to trembling. I sat at the table and stared blankly for a few minutes. That's when the questions started to arise, not the obvious ones, but the most dangerous ones. Did I overreact? Did I misinterpret things? Should I have said something? These questions always arise after an injustice. Not to help, but to confuse. I already knew this path. I had walked it before in other places, with other people, at other times in my life. I got up and went to my room. I changed my clothes, trying to create a minimal sense of normalcy. But normalcy didn't return. The silence of the house seemed louder than the noise in the meeting room hours before. I lay down on the bed, but I couldn't rest. I closed my eyes and unintentionally began to remember the past. Not that distant past, but episodes that I had pushed into a corner of my memory, thinking they were resolved. I remembered the first time I stood up to hard. I spoke my mind, exposed injustices, raised my voice. I remembered how it ended. Isolation, sideways glances, doors closing. At the time, I thought I had done the right thing, and maybe I did. But I paid a high price. After that, I learned to protect myself. I learned to measure my words, to observe before acting, to not react in the heat of the moment. Not out of cowardice, but for survival. And that day, lying there, I wondered if I had gone too far with this protection. Have I become someone who accepts everything? Has silence turned into submission? Am I enduring more than I should? These questions hurt, because part of me feared the answer would be yes. I got up again, now with a restlessness that wouldn't let me stop. I walked around the house, opened the window, breathed in the night air. The street was calm. People passing by, distant conversations, a life happening outside while I tried to organize mine inside. It was there, leaning against the window, that another memory came to me. I remembered who I was when I started working. The enthusiasm, the desire to learn, the belief that effort and competence would be enough. I remembered the pride I felt in every small achievement. I remembered how I believed that respect came automatically with dedication. And I also remembered when that belief began to crack. It didn't happen all at once. It happened gradually. A comment here, another there. A credit taken away, an opinion ignored, a boundary crossed. Small things that in isolation seemed bearable. Together, they formed a weight difficult to explain. That night, I finally accepted something I had been avoiding. It wasn't just a bad day. It wasn't just a difficult person. It was a context that allowed this to happen and that fed on the silence of those who observed. And I was part of that silence. This realization hurt more than any humiliation. It hurt because it forced me to confront a choice I had been putting off for a long time. I could stay there enduring, accumulating internal proof, telling myself I needed more time. Or I could act not impulsively, but consciously. But taking action also came at a cost. It always does. Sitting on the sofa in the dark, I started to cry for real. Not an explosive cry, but a contained cry, the kind that seems to come from the depths of your chest. I cried from exhaustion. I cried from the loneliness of that position. I cried for all the times I was too strong to be comforted. I cried mainly because I realized I wasn't just observing others anymore, I was observing myself as well. And what I saw was not weakness. I saw someone who was tired of fighting the wrong battles. Someone who no longer wanted to prove her worth to those who didn't recognize her humanity. Someone who had learned, perhaps too late, that reacting is not synonymous with winning. It was at that moment that a phrase formed clearly within me, almost like an answer to the questions that had been tormenting me. I can't take it anymore. I understand. Understanding who he was. Understanding who that environment protected. Understanding who benefited from my silence. Understanding, above all, who I no longer wanted to be. The pain didn't subside immediately. On the contrary, it deepened, but it ceased to be confusing. And when pain takes shape, it loses some of its paralyzing power. I got up, grabbed an old notebook, and started writing. Not a detailed plan, not a formal complaint, just notes, episodes, approximate dates, phrases that were said, situations that, before, I tried to downplay. Writing was like lifting a veil. Each word put on paper confirmed something my body already knew. I wasn't exaggerating. I wasn't being overly sensitive. I wasn't making up a problem. The problem existed. And it was consistent. When I finished, I closed the notebook and stared at it for a few seconds. I didn't feel relief. I felt responsibility. Because, from that moment on, I could no longer pretend I didn't know. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. And when I did, it was a light sleep, punctuated by thoughts. But something had changed. I didn't wake up the next day with less pain, I woke up with more clarity. That day's fall wasn't rock bottom. It was the solid ground where I could finally stop falling. I hadn't yet decided what I would do, but I had decided something more important. I was not going to confuse myself anymore. Pain had become the criterion. In the following days, I didn't change anything about my outward behavior. I continued to arrive on time, deliver everything that was asked of me, and perform my duties with the same care as always. To anyone looking from the outside, I was the same discreet, efficient and quiet employee. But inside, something had changed irreversibly. I was no longer observing out of doubt. I was observing for confirmation. I started paying attention to patterns, not isolated episodes, not moments of punctual stress, but repetition. To what was repeated when no one was paying attention. To what happened when the person felt too comfortable to pretend. And the more I observed, the clearer it became. It wasn't just me. It was never just me. I saw how he spoke to people who didn't hold positions of authority, how he interrupted certain people and listened to others with excessive patience, how his tone changed depending on who was in front of him, how some mistakes were treated as learning experiences and others as lack of competence. I saw colleagues leaving meetings in silence, with their eyes downcast. I saw requests ignored. I saw ideas being appropriated. I saw respect being distributed selectively. And I also saw how all of this was being normalized. People learn quickly when complaining is costly. They learn to laugh at hurtful jokes. They learn to swallow hurtful remarks. They learn to adapt in order to survive. I had already learned this before. That's why I recognized it so well now. The most painful thing wasn't his behavior. It was the environment that allowed it. And it was during that period that I became certain of what I needed. Not that impulsive certainty, driven by anger or shame, but a silent, solid certainty, impossible to dismantle. I started gathering everything, not obsessively, not like someone seeking revenge, but like someone who refuses to be discredited again. I wrote down dates. I recorded situations. I saved messages. I observed reactions. Each new episode didn't surprise me. It just fit into place. On one of those days, there was another meeting. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing explosive. Just another opportunity for the same script to repeat itself. And it did, with almost didactic precision. An unfair charge. A snide comment. Irony disguised as a joke. And once again, silence all around. At that moment, something inside me calmed down. It wasn't resignation. It was certainty. I no longer needed proof for myself. I needed to decide what to do with what I already knew. It was then that I understood the silence had served its purpose. I was no longer in the testing phase. I was in the selection phase. I spent the following night awake, but it was different from the previous one. It wasn't a night of anguish. It was a night of inner organization. I wasn't confused. I was lucid. I considered all the possibilities. If I spoke, what would happen? If I didn't speak, what would I lose? If I left, would it be escape or preservation? If I stayed, would I be betraying myself? These questions didn't have simple answers, but they did have one honest answer. I could no longer pretend not to see, and pretending at that point would be more painful than any external consequence. The next day, I went to work with a calmness I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't indifference. It was focus. I knew exactly what I was going to do and, most importantly, how I was going to do it. There would be no scandal. There would be no shouting. There would be no emotional outburst. I didn't need to prove pain. I needed to uphold truth. I chose the most difficult and most dignified path: clear positioning. I scheduled a conversation. Simple, direct, objective. No prior accusations. No threatening tone. Just a conversation. When we sat face to face, he didn't notice anything different immediately. Perhaps because he was used to people reacting in two ways. Either they were overly defensive, or they withdrew. I did neither of those things. I took a deep breath and began to speak. Not about feelings, about facts. I recounted specific situations. I cited dates. I described behaviors. I used precise words without exaggerated adjectives. As I was speaking, I noticed something important. He wasn't denying it. He tried to justify, minimize, relativize, but he wasn't denying it. And that says a lot. When I finished, there was a short silence. Not awkward, revealing. It was then that I said the phrase that had been maturing inside me for weeks, in a firm voice, without aggression, without trembling. I stayed silent to be sure. And now I know exactly who you are. The phrase wasn't meant to hurt. It was said to bring a face to a close. There, something changed in the atmosphere. Not dramatically, but definitively. He tried to explain. He tried to say it wasn't personal. He tried to use words like pressure, demands, and demanding profile. I listened calmly, and I replied with something simple. Demanding doesn't humiliate. Leadership doesn't diminish. Respect doesn't depend on position. There was no further discussion after that, because discussions only exist when there is still doubt. And there was none left. I left that conversation with my heart racing, but my spine straight. I hadn't begged. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't asked for understanding. I had positioned myself. And for someone who had spent so long protecting themselves through silence, this was an act of enormous courage. The consequences began to emerge gradually, not immediately, not in a cinematic way, but real. The atmosphere changed. His behavior changed not out of regret, but out of caution. Other people started talking to me, discreetly, as if they finally felt authorized to do so. I realized something important. When someone breaks the silence with clarity, other voices find space. But regardless of what came next, something had already happened inside me. I was no longer waiting for respect. I had decided who deserved it, and that changes everything. During that period, I also considered the possibility of leaving, not as a defeat, but as a choice. Because dignity also means knowing when to leave when the environment no longer accommodates who you are. And for the first time, that possibility didn't scare me. Because I no longer saw myself as someone who had endured too much. I saw myself as someone who had waited long enough to see. The certainty didn't come as a shout. It came as a tranquil silence. I no longer needed to wonder if I was exaggerating. I no longer needed to seek validation. I no longer needed to shrink back. I knew. And sometimes knowing is more transformative than any external answer. When I got home that day, I didn't cry. Not out of coldness, but because something had settled down. I looked at myself with respect, and no one else could take that away from them. The second climax wasn't the confrontation itself. It was the moment I stopped doubting my own perception. There, the scar stopped hurting, because it had finally been acknowledged. After that conversation, nothing was ever the same again, and curiously, that didn't scare me. I always thought change came with chaos, noise, and abrupt losses. But what came was something else. A silent shift. The atmosphere remained the same. The desks, the hallways, the schedules. People arrived, worked, and left. From the outside, almost nothing had changed. Inside, everything was the same. I started walking differently, not in my body, but in my presence. There was no longer that constant tension in my chest, that internal vigilance of someone who needs to measure every word. I was no longer trying to be accepted. I was whole. The consequences began to appear in layers, some subtle, others very clear. The first thing I realized was that I no longer needed to explain my past silence. It had served its purpose. Those who needed to understand understood. Those who didn't understand, it was no longer my problem. Colleagues who previously barely looked at me began to approach me, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Small conversations in the hallway, comments like "what you said was important," looks of recognition that didn't ask for a response. Others kept their distance, and that, too, was liberating, because I learned something fundamental. Not all separation is a loss. Sometimes it's just a departure of someone who was never truly present. At work, the dynamics began to change slowly, not just because of me, but because when one person takes a clear stance, the entire system feels it. It's not immediate, it's not magic, but it's inevitable. There were adjustments. There was caution. There were attempts to appear different without actually being so. And I observed it all with a newfound tranquility. I no longer needed external transformation to feel worthy. Meanwhile, something even more important happened. I changed the way I saw myself professionally. For a long time, I defined myself by how much I could endure, by how much I could bear without complaining, by how much I gave even without recognition. That seemed like strength. But in reality, it was survival. After that process, I started asking myself something else. What do I deserve? Not in an arrogant way, in a fair way. I started setting clear boundaries, not aggressive, not defensive, just clear. When something went beyond what was acceptable, I didn't just swallow it. I named it, calmly, objectively, without carrying emotions that no longer belonged to me. And to my surprise, this didn't weaken me, it strengthened me. Some people respect boundaries because they understand them. Others respect them because they have no choice. And honestly, I've learned that the reason doesn't matter that much anymore. Respect was evident. At a certain point, the possibility of change arose. A new role, a new department, or even a planned exit. Not as an escape, but as a transition. I considered everything calmly, and that was perhaps the greatest liberation of all. I no longer needed to make any decisions driven by fear. If I stayed, I would stay whole. If I left, I would leave whole. None of the options diminished me. I spoke to myself with an honesty I'd never had before. You owe this place nothing more. You've already proven yourself. Now, choose what will protect you. This internal dialogue changed my way of being in the world. I came to realize how many times, throughout my life, I had confused resilience with forced silence. How many times I thought maturity meant enduring everything in silence. How many times I adapted too much in order not to bother anyone. And gradually, that started to decline. There was no revenge. There was no need to prove anything to anyone. There were no closing speeches. There was dignity. I began to occupy my space naturally. To speak when I needed to be silent when I wanted to, not out of fear, but by choice. That difference is everything. Over time, I realized something curious. People started listening to me more precisely because I wasn't talking all the time. When I did talk, it was because it mattered. And that changed the weight of my voice. Outside of work, this liberation also spread. In conversations with friends, in family relationships, in situations where I previously shrank back to maintain the peace. I came to understand that peace that demands self-effacement is not peace, it's an unfair negotiation. I began to choose myself through small gestures, rejecting what didn't make sense, accepting invitations without guilt, saying no without a long explanation, saying yes without fear of judgment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt aligned, not based on external expectations, but on myself. The most beautiful part of this process was realizing that I didn't need to harden myself to protect myself. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become cold. I didn't become distant. I made myself clear, and clarity eliminates what doesn't fit. If someone were to ask me today if the silence was worth it, I would answer without hesitation. It was because it wasn't passivity. It was preparation. I didn't waste time being silent. I gained discernment. I learned to differentiate between environments that require adaptation and those that require leaving. People who deserve conversation from those who deserve distance. Conflicts that call for confrontation from those that call for detachment. And that's priceless. Today, when I look back, I feel no shame for the woman who remained silent. She did what she needed to do with the tools she had. But I'm proud of the woman I am now, because she doesn't react impulsively. She acts consciously. Liberation didn't come when others changed. It came when I stopped negotiating my worth. And this stays with me every day. I don't know where this story will end professionally, but I know exactly where it began to change. The moment I chose to understand before reacting. And I chose myself. Today, looking back on everything I've been through, I understand something that took me years to learn. Not all silence is weakness, and not every immediate reaction is courage. For a long time, I was taught that silence implies consent, that those who don't respond immediately are accepting it, that those who endure it are diminishing themselves. I believed it, and because of that, for years, I blamed myself for my own silence. But the truth is different. There is a kind of silence that is not an absence of strength, it is an accumulation of it. There is a kind of waiting that is not fear, it is understanding. And there is a kind of calm that does not come from submission, it comes from clarity. I remained silent because I needed to understand. To understand people. To understand patterns. To understand boundaries. If I had reacted at the first sign of disrespect, perhaps I would have been seen as difficult. If I had raised my voice too soon, perhaps I would have been discredited. If I had exploded, perhaps I would have missed the chance to see everything clearly. The silence at that moment was my space for observation. And observation changes everything. When you observe, you notice who makes a mistake once, and who repeats it. You notice who apologizes, and who justifies themselves. You notice who respects out of conscience, and who only respects when confronted. Reacting too quickly often protects those who don't deserve it, because it gives that person the chance to superficially adjust without ever revealing who they really are. Silence, when chosen, becomes a mirror, and not everyone likes what they see reflected. After that experience, I began to see other stories more carefully. How many people are labeled as weak when, in fact, they are just waiting for the right moment? How many women are called submissive when, in fact, they are building inner clarity? How many professionals are judged for not reacting when, in fact, they are protecting their own dignity? Not every fight needs an audience. Not every response needs to be immediate. Not every wound calls for confrontation, some call for awareness. Today, I don't romanticize silence. I don't think it's always the best option, but I don't demonize it either. I've learned that it's a tool, and like any tool, it depends on how and why it's used. What set me free wasn't shouting. It wasn't winning an argument. It wasn't proving I was right. What set me free was understanding that respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you choose from whom you accept it. I stopped wasting energy trying to convince those who never wanted to see. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped justifying my stance. I started living with clearer criteria and firmer boundaries. And that changed everything. If you, the listener of this story, have ever been silent at some point, perhaps you recognize yourself here. Perhaps you've wondered if you were making a mistake, if you were being weak, if you were wasting time. Perhaps you've carried guilt for not reacting as others expected. Therefore, I leave you with a few questions not to answer aloud, but to feel from within. Have you ever remained silent to better understand a situation? Have you noticed that sometimes speaking too soon closes doors that silence keeps open? Have you observed how some truths only emerge when you stop reacting and start observing? And more importantly, have you ever realized that choosing where to stay and where to leave is one of the most profound forms of self-love? Not all silence is fear. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's emotional maturity. And if this story touched you in any way, I invite you to be a part of it. Comment below. Have you ever remained silent to understand the truth? Or have you ever reacted too quickly and paid a high price for it? Like and follow the channel. Here, we don't react impulsively. We understand scars.